Morning students, this is video lecture for blog post 331, the second battle of Ypres, and the first use successfully of chemical warfare. Now this is a somber occasion in World War I. If you recall, we have to go back to the first battle of Ypres in order to get our context before we even start on today's lesson. Last week we talked about how important the city of Ypres was to both sides of the army, both sides of the opposing armies. The Germans could not afford to let the British get past them at Ypres because they could not afford for their ships to be overtaken. Not their ships, their railroads to be overtaken and destroyed by the Allied people, because that would cut them off from the southern part of their army. Likewise, the British could not afford to be cut off from the seaports of Calais and Dunkirk and other seaports along the French coast. That would also cut them off from receiving essential aid to their cause. So both armies had a huge amount to win or lose at these battles. Now, if you recall, the first Battle of Ypres ended with a pseudo-stalemate. It ended in November of 14 with the German soldiers falling back slightly and the British and French contingency remaining successful in holding the town. However, it was a battle that resulted in the loss of great amount of life, with 100,000 troops dying on the British and French side and 130,000 dying on the German side. The first Battle of Ypres concluded because of winter. We talked about how winter generally is a very poor time to fight in battles. So because of this, the fighting ceased, and each side planned for the next move. Now the fighting ceased. Both sides didn't believe that the issue was actually finished or over. Both sides knew that they would resume in the spring, and that's exactly what happened. Now the Germans were not content to just let the Allies keep Ypres. So over the period of time when the fighting had ceased, up until early April, up until late April, they decided they needed to try something a little bit different. Now, if you recall, the entire point of the Germans trying to get at France, trying to get at Paris, was to end the threat of a two-front war that they were fighting at this point. Remember, they had Russia over here on this side, their foe, and they had the other enemy, France, on the other side. So they were politically bordering both of their enemies, meaning that their armies had to go to both places. And it is a very difficult thing to win a two-front war. So the logical explanation, or the logical fix for this problem, would be to obviously eliminate one of the fronts. Defeat one front easily so you can focus all of your attention on the other. So, that being said, they still needed to very, very quickly end the French front, which they saw as the easier of the two to do so. Over the spring hiatus between the first Battle of Ypres and the second Battle of Ypres, the German army attempted the first use of chemical warfare on their eastern front. However, as evidenced by many, many, many battles and skirmishes and armies and wars in the past, the eastern front is quite cold. Russia's main ally is, again, its weather. And so when the canisters that held the chlorine gas that they were attempting to use for the first time, when they were deployed by means of people literally carrying them to the eastern front to be used in the battle, they froze rather than detonating. And so it was unsuccessful, and the chlorine gas did not get released on the Russian front as the Germans had hoped for during the hiatus between the first battle and the second Battle of Ypres. British intelligence was aware of these tests and this attempt to use chemical warfare on Germany's use of chemical warfare on its opponents. And it was a high level of awareness. This would be due to a series of spies, a series of covert intelligent missions, and they found out that the Germans were very speedily trying to get this new type of warfare off the ground. So that even being so, these details did not necessarily filter down to the very basic troop level. And that makes sense because there is in almost every military organization a series of need-to-know-ness. And the higher up you get in the military, the more you need to know, and the lower down you are, the less you need to know, and that need to know is determined by the superiors in the army. So when the fighting began again on the first in the site of Ypres, when the fighting began again in late April, there were Canadian contingencies, there were French contingencies, and there were British contingencies, all protecting the city of Ypres and the ports thus behind it. They were not aware of the German intention, and they were not aware that this would be anything other than what it had previously been in the fall, which was horrific enough as it is, with the trench warfare, with the rain, the blood, the mud, it just, all of it was horrific. And to imagine something possibly being worse than that would never have entered into the minds of the combatants up until that point. So on the 22nd of April, after exchanging fire with the Allied armies, which was essentially cover to get the canisters, the big barrels of not just like, video game canisters where you just shoot them over, but like big canisters filled with chlorine gas to get them over to the front line. They consulted the weather reports, making sure that the wind of that day would carry any gas that is emitted from these canisters over to the enemy line. And so as they set the canisters, they shot the canisters, gas began to emit from the big barrel canisters as they had intended, and just as they had planned, the wind of that day, is a spring day, windy spring day, it carried this yellow cloud of gas over to the French soldiers, the British soldiers, the Canadian soldiers who were holding Ypres. It was exactly as the Germans intended. It worked perfectly for a particular purpose, obviously. But even with it working perfectly, the Germans were not quite ready for the exact extent of the devastation. When it was all said and done, the Germans were shocked at the amount of casualties that were caused by this particular gas attack, this one gas attack, because it far exceeded what they had imagined it could possibly do. The accounts of the French and British and Canadian soldiers experiencing these gas attacks are horrific. Remember, they will have seen nothing like this. This wasn't like later on in the war when gas attacks would be expected and you would see the masks being worn by the combatants. This wasn't like that. This had never occurred. And so imagine you see this cloud of never before seen gas. And they were curious, what is this? What's going on? And as soon as the gas began to fill in and fall down into their trenches, because it was a heavy gas, it would fall down into the trenches that they were protecting. Remember that they built in order to protect them. They started to experience painful needles in their chest, clawing at their throats, not being able to get a breath in, and they literally suffocated with this chlorine gas burning up and down in their esophagus. A horrific, painful way to die, all while not knowing what is happening. What am I experiencing? And the confusion and the horror and the fear all mingled in together with the horrificness of people dying left and right beside you. It was one of the most traumatic experiences that a person could go through on Earth. And it was traumatic for the Allies, very traumatic. It was traumatic for the people that survived because they were maimed, wounded, psychologically maimed. When we look later on at some of the German accounts of this chemical attack, we start to see that some of the Canadian and French troops survived and ran towards the town at Ypres, alerting the citizens that this fog of gas was coming, and that citizens, children, women, men, they were all forced to leave quickly the town of Ypres so that they were not engulfed in the same terror that had just befallen the defenders of the city. The city gates were thrown wide, and people were dying along the road, trying to flee from this. So this is a horrific event. I wanted to read you an excerpt from Watership Down, because I know how much you enjoy this book, students, but I'm afraid my video might run a little long, so I will list it as part of the blog post itself, so that you can read it and discern whether or not you think this is an indicative moment in the book that is indicative of this first attack. So be on the lookout for that literary analysis later on. And so one of the things that I want you to think about and ask yourself about when you look and think about the Second Battle of Ypres is, how could it possibly be worse than the first? And I think it was the confusion and fear. Because if you recall, the body count of the first Battle of Ypres was far higher. However, there's something to the expectation of loss in war that doesn't catch you as off guard as the surprise, fear, and horror that these gas attacks did. Now, we've said German gas attack, German gas attack, German gas attack. After this, the Allies also begin to use gas on the Germans. So it is not purely a German ploy to use on the British. The British, the French, all of them start to use gas back. And this is one of the things that becomes very normal in World War I. World War I is characterized by three things, and all three of these things are present at the Second Battle of Ypres. And those three things are an astronomical loss of life. That first chemical attack, that first wave of noxious gas, killed 5,000 people immediately. And 10,000 people were injured, maimed, and wounded. So the first thing is astronomical loss of life. The second thing is the trench warfare. The same trenches that we saw in the race to the race to the sea are still present, and there are still men living and dying in these muddy trenches for the sake of this city, for the sake of this strategic point. And the third thing that is indicative of World War I that has come to be almost synonymous with the fight itself is chemical warfare. And this is the first time that we see this successfully used. And so the questions I want you to think about when you're looking at your assignment, first off, I'm linking two primary sources, two letters, or one letter and one biographical account of the Second Battle of Ypres by two people that were there, one German soldier and one Canadian soldier. I want you to read both of those, and then I want you to think about the tone of each of these accounts, the tone of the German, the tone of the Canadian. How can you pull resources from these accounts to prove this is how this person felt about this? And then I want you to think about, is there such a thing as going too far in war? Or is it all fair? Is there such a thing about morality in warfare, or good fighting versus bad fighting? Is that a thing, or is it made up? Is there such a thing as good fighting? These are things that I want you to think about, and I want you to support your opinion. I'll see you guys in class.